The morning sun of Zentara Prime cast gentle purple light through the crystal windows of the Galactic Academy. Inside Classroom 7 Alpha, students from across the galaxy sat in their specially designed seats, each one built for different body types and needs. The air was perfectly filtered and temperature controlled to keep everyone comfortable. Professor Kelthon stood at the front of the room, his tall, crystalline body catching the light and throwing rainbow patterns on the walls. His species, the Zentari, had been teachers and scholars for thousands of years. Today felt like any other day in his long career, but he had no idea how wrong he was. "Class, we have a new exchange student joining us today," Professor Kelthon announced, his voice making soft chiming sounds that his translator converted to standard galactic speech. "Please welcome Jake Morrison from the planet Earth." The door slid open with a quiet hiss, and Jake walked in. He looked around the room, with curious brown eyes taking in his new classmates. To most of the students, he seemed very ordinary. He had no shiny scales like the Oceani students, no beautiful crystal formations like the Zentari, and no graceful leaf patterns like the Verdani. He was just average height with short brown hair, wearing simple blue pants and a plain white shirt. Jake raised his hand in what his species called a wave. "Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all." The other students barely looked up from their study tablets. They had seen many exchange students before, usually from peaceful garden worlds where the biggest worry was which flowers to plant next. Earth sounded like just another boring agricultural planet. Zixtal, a student from the insect-like Cathera species, shared his thoughts with his hive mind brothers and sisters back home. The new human looked weak and soft, with no natural armor or weapons. His pale skin seemed thin and easily damaged. Zixtal's compound eyes noted that Jake had no visible way to defend himself. Koralsha, an Oceani student with blue-green skin and gills on her neck, thought Jake looked like he might drown in a shallow puddle. Her people were excellent swimmers, who could hold their breath for hours underwater. This human did not even seem to have webbed fingers. "Please take the empty seat next to Crystal Lynn," Professor Kelthon said, pointing to a spot near the middle of the room. Jake walked over and sat down next to Crystal Lynn, a young Zentari whose body sparkled like a living diamond. She gave him a polite nod, but then went back to reading about peaceful conflict resolution techniques. "Today we will be studying hostile environment survival," Professor Kelthon announced. "This is an important theoretical subject that helps us understand how different species might react to challenging conditions." The students settled in for what they expected to be another easy lesson. On their homeworlds, hostile environment usually meant something like rain lasting more than an hour, or temperature changes of a few degrees. Professor Kelthon activated a holographic display showing various planetary conditions. "Who can give me an example of a challenging environmental condition?" Sage, a Verdani student whose skin was covered in beautiful green leaves, raised her hand. "On my world, sometimes clouds block the sun for a whole day. We have to use artificial light supplements to keep our photosynthesis working." "Excellent example," Professor Kelthon said. "Anyone else?" Finri, another Oceani student, spoke up. "Our oceans sometimes have temperature variations of up to 3 degrees during seasonal changes. It can be quite uncomfortable and requires us to adjust our daily swimming patterns." The class nodded in understanding. These were the kinds of serious environmental challenges they were used to hearing about. Crystal Lynn added, "Last year, our climate control system had a malfunction that caused indoor temperatures to vary by almost 5 degrees for nearly 6 hours. Many of my people had to take sick leave to recover from the stress." Professor Kelthon made notes on his tablet. These are all good examples of how even small environmental changes can affect different species. Now, let us discuss theoretical, extreme conditions that some planets might have. He brought up images of harsh theoretical worlds that existed only in computer models. Imagine a planet where temperatures might vary by 10 or even 15 degrees seasonally. How do you think intelligent life might adapt to such extreme conditions? The students looked at the images with expressions of horror and fascination. Such extreme worlds seemed impossible to them. "They would probably have to live deep underground," suggested Zixtal. "No surface life could survive such terrible conditions." "Perhaps They would need to hibernate during the dangerous seasons, added Coral Shaw. Jake listened to his classmates with growing confusion. He raised his hand slowly. Yes, Jake, Professor Kelthon said. Do you have thoughts on these theoretical extreme environments? Well, Jake said, scratching his head, I was just wondering about the temperature thing. On Earth, where I come from, temperatures change by about 60 or 70 degrees between summer and winter, sometimes more in some places. The classroom fell silent. Every student turned to stare at Jake. Professor Kelthon blinked his crystal eyes. I am sorry, could you repeat that? My translator may have made an error. Oh, sure, Jake said, not noticing the shocked expressions around him. In my hometown, summer temperatures get up to about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and winter can drop to 20 below zero. That is like a 110-degree difference throughout the year. Crystal Lynn's body stopped sparkling entirely, which happened when Zentari experienced extreme shock. That is impossible, whispered Sage. No living thing could survive such extreme temperature variations. Jake looked confused. Really? I mean, we just wear different clothes. Heavy coats in winter, lighter stuff in summer. Pretty much everyone. Does it? Professor Kelthon was making rapid calculations on his tablet. His crystal face flickered with different colors as he processed the information. Jake, are you certain about these numbers? This would classify your planet as a Class 12 Deathworld. Deathworld? Jake laughed. No, Earth is actually pretty. Nice, great place to live. We have beautiful forests, mountains, oceans. Lots of people love spending time outdoors. The students exchanged worried glances. Zixtal had lost his connection to the hive mind entirely, which only happened during extreme trauma. Coralsha's gills were fluttering rapidly, a sign of deep distress among her people. Perhaps, Professor Kelthon said carefully, you could tell us more about your homeworld's environment? Sure, Jake said, happy to share. We have 4 seasons. Spring is nice and mild, though we get some pretty good thunderstorms. Summer can be hot and humid, great for swimming. Fall is beautiful when the leaves change colors, though we get some strong winds sometimes. Winter has snow and ice, perfect for skiing and ice skating. Each thing Jake mentioned as pleasant and normal sent new waves of horror through his classmates. Thunderstorms meant electrical discharges that could kill. Strong winds could knock over buildings. Snow and ice meant freezing temperatures that would kill most galactic species in minutes. This snow and ice, Crystal Lynn asked weakly, how do your people survive it? Oh, we have houses with heating systems, Jake explained, and warm clothes. Boots, hats, gloves. Some people really love winter sports. My sister goes snowboarding every weekend when there is enough snow. Your sister voluntarily goes out into freezing conditions for recreation? Sage asked, her leaf patterns turning pale with shock. Yeah, lots of people do. Winter sports are pretty popular. Skiing, snowboarding, ice hockey, sledding. Kids build snowmen and have snowball fights. It is fun. Professor Kelthon was quietly updating his notes. The environmental conditions Jake described as normal recreation would require emergency survival protocols for any other known species. The bell chimed softly, indicating the end of class. Students began packing their tablets and materials, but they moved slowly, still processing what they had heard. For tomorrow, Professor Kelthon announced, please read Chapter 12 on Theoretical Adaptation Strategies. Class dismissed. As the students filed out, they whispered among themselves in their various languages. The human from Earth had just described living conditions that would kill most of them within hours, and he talked about it like discussing the weather. Jake packed his simple backpack and stood up. He noticed his classmates seemed quiet and thoughtful. See you tomorrow, he said cheerfully to Crystal Lynn. This environmental survival class seems really interesting. I bet I could share some stories about camping trips back home. Crystal Lynn managed a weak nod, her crystal body barely glowing. After Jake left the room, she turned to her friends. Did he just say he voluntarily goes into those deadly conditions for fun? She whispered. Professor Kelthon overheard and made another note in Jake's file. Tomorrow's class was going to be very interesting indeed. The next morning came with the same gentle purple sunrise that had greeted Zentara Prime for millions of years. Students filed into the environmental survival classroom, but there was a different feeling in the air. Word had spread through the academy about the strange human student who claimed to live in impossible conditions. Jake walked in with the same friendly smile as before, carrying his simple backpack and wearing another plain outfit. He waved at his classmates and sat down, next to Crystalline, who had spent the entire night researching something called temperature variation survival in the Galactic database. "Good morning, everyone," Professor Kelthon said as he activated the classroom's environmental controls. "Before we continue with today's lesson, I thought we might have an informal discussion about environmental adaptation strategies." The students settled into their seats, but many kept glancing at Jake. They had all heard the rumors about his claims from yesterday. "Why don't we start by sharing some challenges from our homeworlds?" Professor Kelthon suggested. "Perhaps we can learn from each other's experiences." Kira, a Verdani student with bright yellow leaf patterns, raised her hand first. "On my world, we sometimes experience what we call harsh seasonal changes. During our difficult season, sunlight, levels drop by almost 15% for 3 whole months. It's so severe that our government provides special light therapy sessions for everyone." The other students nodded sympathetically. A 15% reduction in sunlight was considered a major environmental crisis. "That sounds really tough," Jake said genuinely. "How do people cope with that?" Kira looked surprised that he was taking her seriously. "Well, we have to use artificial growing lights, and many people take supplements to help with the reduced photosynthesis. Some even have to move to special climate-controlled domes until the harsh season passes." "Wow," Jake said. "On Earth, we have something called winter where some places don't see the sun for months at a time." The room went very quiet again. Crystal Lynn leaned forward. "What do you mean, don't see the sun for months?" "Oh, in the polar regions during winter the sun doesn't come up at all for several months. People call it polar night. But lots of people still live there year-round." Zixtal's antennae twitched nervously. "Your people live in places with no solar energy for months and survive?" "Sure," Jake said with a shrug. "They use artificial lights and heating systems. Some people actually prefer living in those areas. My uncle lives in Alaska, and he says the northern lights are beautiful during the dark months." Professor Kelthon was frantically taking notes. "Jake, when you say heating systems, what kind of temperatures are we discussing?" "Well, in Alaska it can get down to 40 or 50 below zero in winter, sometimes colder." Every single student in the room stared at Jake in absolute silence. The temperature he just mentioned casually would instantly freeze the bodily fluids of most species present. Sage spoke up in a whisper. 40 below zero? That's colder than our emergency freeze storage units." "Yeah, it gets pretty cold," Jake agreed. "But people just dress warmly and heat their houses. Kids still go to school and everything. You just have to be prepared." Coral Shaw, the Oceani student, raised a trembling hand. "Jake, what do you mean by dress warmly? How do your people survive temperatures that would kill most life forms?" Jake thought for a moment. "Well, we wear layers. Thermal underwear, thick pants, insulated jackets, warm boots, hats, gloves, scarves. Some people have special gear for really cold weather. My dad has this Arctic suit for when he works outside in winter." "Your father works outside in those deadly conditions?" Finry asked, his gills fluttering with distress. "Well, he's a construction worker, so yeah. Work doesn't usually stop for weather unless it's really extreme." "What do you consider really extreme?" Professor Kelthon asked carefully. Jake scratched his head. "I guess when it gets down to like 70 below, or when there's a really bad blizzard with high winds, even then some people still have to work. Emergency services, hospital workers, that kind of thing." Crystal Lynn's body had gone completely dim. "Emergency services work in those conditions?" "Oh yeah, ambulances, fire trucks, police. People still need help during bad weather. Actually, that's when they're needed most." The students were beginning to understand that Jake's definition of bad weather would be classified as a planetary extinction event on most worlds. Zixtal managed to speak. "On my world, if the temperature drops even 5 degrees below normal, we declare a planetary emergency and everyone goes into deep hibernation until conditions improve." "Really?" Jake asked with interest. How long do you hibernate? Until the temperature returns to safe levels, usually a few days at most. Jake nodded. That makes sense for your species. Humans don't hibernate, so we just adapt to the seasons as they come. But how? Sage asked desperately. How do you survive in conditions that would kill us in minutes? Well, we evolved on Earth, so I guess we're built for it, Jake explained. Humans are pretty adaptable. We live everywhere from hot deserts to frozen tundra, from sea level to high mountains. Professor Kelthon looked up from his notes. Jake, you mentioned deserts and mountains. Could you describe these environments? Sure. Deserts can get really hot during the day, sometimes over 120 degrees. But they can also get surprisingly cold at night, sometimes below freezing. The temperature swings Jake described would cause most alien species to die from thermal shock. And people live in these places? Crystal Lynn asked weakly. Millions of people. Some of our biggest cities are in desert areas. Phoenix, Las Vegas, parts of California. People just use air conditioning when it's hot. What about the mountains you mentioned? Coralsha asked. Mountains are great. I love hiking and camping in the mountains. The air gets thinner as you go higher up, and it's usually colder, but the views are amazing. Thinner air? Finry repeated. How thin? Well, at high altitudes there's less oxygen. Some people get altitude sickness until they get used to it. But lots of people live in mountain towns. Denver is called the Mile High City because it's over 5,000 feet above sea level. The Oceani students looked horrified. Their species needed precisely balanced atmospheric conditions to survive. Your people live in places where there's not enough oxygen? Sage asked. Well, there's still oxygen, just less of it. Mountain climbers go even higher. Some climb mountains over 29,000 feet tall. For what purpose? Zixtal asked, his compound eyes wide with confusion. For fun, mostly. Or challenge. Mount Everest is the tallest mountain on Earth. Hundreds of people climb it every year. Professor Kelthon was comparing Jake's casual statements to the galactic database of extreme survival conditions. Everything Jake described as normal human recreation would require specialized military equipment and training for other species. Jake, Professor Kelthon said slowly, when you say people climb these mountains for fun, do they use environmental suits? Some use oxygen tanks for the really high peaks, but mostly just warm clothes and climbing gear. Oh, and they have to watch out for avalanches. Avalanches? Crystal Lynn whispered. Yeah, when snow breaks loose and slides down the mountain. They can be pretty dangerous if you're caught in one. Jake's classmates sat in stunned silence as they processed the fact that humans voluntarily put themselves in situations where tons of frozen precipitation could bury them alive, and they considered this recreational activity. The morning break chime sounded, but nobody moved. I think, Professor Kelthon said carefully, we should continue this discussion after break. Jake, would you mind staying after class today? I'd like to learn more about your homeworld. Sure, no problem, Jake said cheerfully. I've got lots of stories about Earth. Wait until you hear about hurricane season. As Jake left for break, the remaining students and professor sat in silence, each wondering what other impossible things this friendly human considered normal parts of life. Professor Kelthon opened his communication device and sent an urgent message to the Academy's Xenobiology department. They needed to completely reassess what they thought they knew about the species called humans. The third day brought Professor Veltara to classroom 7 Alpha. She was an Oceani marine biologist with smooth blue-green skin and large, gentle eyes. Her specialty was xenobiology, the study of life forms across different worlds. Today's lesson was supposed to be about peaceful coexistence between species and their environments. Jake walked into the classroom carrying the same simple backpack, but today he had brought something extra. He pulled out what looked like a primitive electronic device and set it on his desk. Several students noticed it, but assumed it was some kind of basic calculator. Good morning, class, Professor Veltara said, her voice flowing like gentle waves through the translator. Today we will discuss the wonderful diversity of life in our galaxy. Each world has developed beautiful, peaceful creatures that live in harmony with their environments. The students settled in, expecting another relaxing lesson about gentle herbivores and filter-feeding organisms that drifted peacefully through perfect ecosystems. Let us start by sharing an interesting species from each of your homeworlds, Professor Veltara suggested. Who would like to go first? Sage raised her hand eagerly. On my world, we have these beautiful creatures called light dancers. They are like floating flowers that drift on warm air currents. They feed on sunlight and morning dew, and they create the most amazing light patterns when they dance together in groups. Wonderful, Professor Veltara said with a smile. What a peaceful, harmonious species. Crystal Lynn spoke next. We have crystal singers on my world. They are small, delicate beings that live inside mineral formations. They make beautiful music by vibrating their crystal bodies. The sounds help our meditation and bring peace to everyone who hears them. The class sighed happily at the description of such gentle creatures. Zixtal shared next. In our hive cities, we have tiny helper bugs that organize everything for us. They sort our food, clean our spaces, and help maintain perfect order. Everyone has a specific job, and there is never any conflict. These all sound like perfect examples of peaceful evolution, Professor Veltara noted. How about you, Coralsha? The Oceani student brightened. We have gentle current riders in our seas. They are like living silk scarves that flow with the ocean currents. They filter tiny particles from the water and help keep our oceans perfectly clean. They never hurt anything and spend their whole lives just dancing through the warm, shallow waters. Professor Veltara was delighted. Excellent examples of how life develops in stable, nurturing environments. Jake, would you like to share a species from Earth? Jake looked up from his device. Oh, sure. There are so many to choose from. How about sharks? Sharks, Professor Veltara repeated. That is an interesting name. Are they similar to our current riders? Gentle filter feeders, perhaps? Jake thought for a moment. Well, some sharks do filter feed, but most are what we call apex predators. Great white sharks can grow up to 20 feet long and weigh over 5,000 pounds. They have rows of razor-sharp teeth that can cut through almost anything. The classroom fell silent. Professor Veltara's gills stopped moving completely. Cut through anything? Sage whispered. Yeah, their teeth are like serrated knives. They can bite through metal, bone, pretty much whatever they want, and they can smell a single drop of blood in the water from miles away. Crystal Lynn's body went dim again. Miles away? Oh yeah, sharks have incredible senses. They can detect electrical fields from other animals' heartbeats and muscle movements. Makes them really efficient hunters. Zixtal's compound eyes were wide with horror. These creatures hunt other living beings? Well, that's how they survive, Jake explained. They're carnivores. They eat fish, seals, sometimes other sharks. The ocean food chain, you know. Professor Veltara was making rapid notes. Jake, these sharks, do they live in isolated areas away from your people? Not really. People swim and surf in the same waters all the time. Most sharks don't bother humans, but attacks do happen sometimes. Attacks? Coralsha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, shark attacks. Usually it's a case of mistaken identity. Surfers on boards can look like seals from below. Most people survive if they get medical help quickly. The alien students stared at Jake in complete shock. He was describing creatures that sounded like living weapons, and humans voluntarily entered their habitat for recreation. Do you have other species like these sharks? Professor Veltara asked carefully. Jake's face lit up. Oh, tons. Bears are pretty impressive. Grizzly bears can weigh up to 800 pounds and run 35 miles per hour. They have claws longer than your fingers and can break a person's neck with one swipe. Finray made a choking sound. And humans live near these creatures? Some people live right in bear country. Campers and hikers see them pretty regularly. You just have to know what to do. Make noise so you don't surprise them, keep food sealed up, carry bear spray. Bear spray? Sage asked weakly. It's like pepper spray but stronger. Burns their eyes and nose so they'll leave you alone. Usually works pretty well. Jake pulled out his device and started scrolling through something. Oh, here's a cool picture. My brother sent me last week. He was hiking and ran into this grizzly with her cubs. He showed the screen to Crystal Lynn, who immediately went completely transparent with shock. The image showed a massive, fur-covered creature with claws like daggers standing just a few feet away from where the picture was taken. "Your brother was that close to this monster?" Crystal Lynn managed to ask. "Well, you're supposed to keep your distance, especially when they have babies, but sometimes you run into them on trails." He just backed away slowly and waited for them to move on. Professor Veltara was struggling to process this information. "What other species should we know about?" Jake thought for a moment. "Snakes are interesting. We have some really venomous ones. Rattlesnakes, copperheads, coral snakes. Their venom can kill you in minutes if you don't get anti-venom." "Venom?" Zixtal asked, his antennae twitching with fear. "Yeah, it's like poison they inject when they bite. Some snake venoms attack your nervous system, others dissolve your blood cells, some cause massive tissue damage." The students were learning that Earth was populated by creatures that could kill in multiple horrible ways. Spiders too, Jake continued. Black widows, brown recluses. Their bites can cause necrosis where your flesh actually dies and rots away, and some spiders are huge. Tarantulas can have leg spans of almost a foot. Sage was turning pale green, which happened when Verdani experienced extreme nausea. "Oh, and jellyfish," Jake added. "Box jellyfish are probably one of the most venomous creatures on Earth. Their sting causes pain so intense that people can go into shock and drown before they reach shore." "People swim in waters with these creatures?" Coralsha asked in horror. "Well, you have to be careful. Some beaches have warning signs during jellyfish season. But yeah, people still swim and surf." Professor Veltara was comparing Jake's descriptions to the galactic database of known dangerous species. Every creature he mentioned would be classified as a Class A threat, requiring immediate evacuation protocols. "Jake," she said slowly, "how do humans manage to survive on a world populated by so many dangerous predators?" "Oh, most of them are more afraid of us than we are of them," Jake said with a laugh. "Humans are actually pretty scary when we need to be. We're persistence hunters, tool users, pack coordinators. Most animals know to avoid us." The implication that humans were scarier than the monsters Jake had just described sent a chill through the classroom. "But some people actually seek out these dangerous animals," Jake continued. "Wildlife photographers, researchers, documentary makers. Some people swim with sharks in cages, others track bears to study them." "They do this voluntarily?" Professor Veltara asked faintly. "Oh yeah, it's exciting. My cousin is a marine biologist who studies great whites. She says swimming with them is one of the most amazing experiences you can have." The bell chimed for the end of class, but nobody moved. They were all too stunned by the revelation that humans shared their world with, creatures that sounded like something from their worst nightmares. Jake packed up his device and slung his backpack over his shoulder. "Tomorrow I could tell you about some of the smaller creatures if you want. Mosquitoes, ticks, fire ants. The little ones can actually be more dangerous than the big predators." As Jake left the room, Professor Veltara sat down heavily. She realized she needed to completely revise her understanding of predator-prey relationships and ecosystem dynamics. Earth wasn't just a world with dangerous creatures. It was a world where the most dangerous creature of all was apparently the cheerful young human who just walked out of her classroom. The fourth day started differently than the others. Word had spread throughout the academy about the human student who claimed to live among deadly predators. Several professors had gathered outside classroom 7 Alpha, pretending to have casual conversations while actually waiting to hear what impossible things Jake would say next. Inside the classroom, the students sat quietly as Professor Kelthon prepared for what he had announced would be a current events discussion. This was normally a peaceful time when students shared pleasant news from their homeworlds, but nothing felt normal anymore. Jake entered the room carrying his backpack and the same primitive device from yesterday. He seemed completely unaware of the tension in the air and sat down with his usual friendly smile. "Good morning, everyone," Professor Kelthon said, his crystal body flickering with nervous energy. "Today we will share recent news from our homeworlds. This helps us understand how different civilizations handle current challenges." Crystal Lynn raised her hand first, eager to start with something normal. "On my world, we had a minor climate adjustment last week. One of our weather control satellites experienced a small malfunction that caused a temperature variation of 1.7 degrees for approximately 4 hours. The other students nodded sympathetically. Such a malfunction would be major news anywhere in the galaxy. Our government responded immediately, Crystal Lynn continued. They declared a state of mild concern and activated emergency comfort protocols. Everyone was given extra rest time and access to temperature regulation therapy until the crisis passed. That sounds like an excellent response to such a challenging situation, Professor Kelthon said. Anyone else? Sage spoke up next. Our Agricultural Ministry announced that this growing season, cloud cover reduced average sunlight by 3% compared to last year. They're calling it the Great Dimming and have approved emergency funding for supplemental growing lights across the entire planet, the class murmured with concern. A 3% reduction in sunlight was indeed serious news for a photosynthetic species. Coralsha shared next. Our Ocean Management Council reported that thermal currents shifted by 0.5 degree last month. They're monitoring the situation closely and have advised all citizens to avoid deep water activities until conditions stabilize. These reports represented major environmental events worthy of planetary attention on their respective worlds. Jake, Professor Kelthon said carefully, would you like to share any recent news from Earth? Jake pulled out his device and swiped through something that looked like a news application. Let me see what's been happening back home. He scrolled through the screen, and his classmates noticed there seemed to be a lot of text and images flowing past. Oh, looks like tornado season is starting early this year in the Midwest, Jake said casually. There was a pretty big outbreak last week, about 40 tornadoes in one day. The classroom went silent. 40 what? Zixtal asked weakly. Tornadoes. They're like spinning columns of air that form during storms. Wind speeds can reach over 200 miles per hour. They can destroy entire towns. Professor Kelthon was frantically taking notes. And this happened in one day? Yeah, spring is tornado season. Some years are worse than others. This one tornado last week was rated EF4, which means winds between 160 to 200 miles per hour. It carved a path about 0.5 mile wide and 20 miles long. Crystal Lynn's body had gone completely transparent. How many people were killed? Actually, only 3 people died, which is pretty good for a tornado that size. Most people got to storm shelters in time. The concept that only 3 deaths from a single weather event could be considered good news was horrifying to his classmates. Storm shelters? Sage asked. Yeah. Reinforced underground rooms or buildings where people go when tornadoes are coming. Most houses in tornado areas have basements or safe rooms. Kids learn tornado drills in school. Finry spoke up shakily. Children are trained for these disasters? Oh, sure. Tornado drills, fire drills, earthquake drills, hurricane preparation. It's just part of growing up. Jake continued scrolling through his newsfeed. Oh, and there's a hurricane forming in the Atlantic. They're calling it Hurricane Lisa. Looks like it might hit the East Coast next week. Hurricane? Coralsha whispered. Massive storms with winds over 74 miles per hour. The big ones can have winds over 150 miles per hour and cover hundreds of miles. They bring heavy rain, flooding, and storm surge. Storm surge? Professor Kelthon asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. When the hurricane pushes ocean water onto land, can be like a moving wall of water 15 or 20 feet high. Pretty dangerous if you don't evacuate. The alien students were learning that Earth's weather actively tried to kill its inhabitants on a regular basis. But people evacuate, right? Sage asked hopefully. Most do, but some people ride out hurricanes. Storm chasers actually follow them to study them and take pictures. My friend Dave is a meteorologist who flies planes right into the eye of hurricanes to measure wind speeds. Your friend voluntarily flies into these deadly storms? Zixtal asked in disbelief. Yeah, hurricane hunter pilots are pretty brave. They fly through the eye wall where the winds are strongest. The data they collect helps predict where the hurricane will go and how strong it'll be. Jake kept scrolling. Oh, here's something interesting. There was a pretty good earthquake in California yesterday. Magnitude 6.2. Professor Kelthon looked up from his notes. Earthquake? when the ground shakes because of moving tectonic plates. This one was strong enough to knock things off shelves and crack some buildings, but no major damage. The ground moves? Crystal Lynn asked in horror. Well, the whole planet's surface is made of big plates that slowly move around. Sometimes, they slip suddenly and cause earthquakes. California gets them pretty regularly because it sits on several fault lines. And people still choose to live in these areas? Coralsha asked. Oh yeah, millions of people. San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego. Great cities even with the earthquake risk. Most buildings are designed to handle shaking now. Jake continued reading. Looks like there's a wildfire burning in Colorado. Already burned about 50,000 acres. Wildfire? Sage asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. When forests or grasslands catch fire and burn, sometimes they're started by lightning, sometimes by accidents. This one is threatening some mountain towns, so they're evacuating people and bringing in firefighter crews. People fight fires? Finri asked. Yeah, firefighters are trained to battle wildfires. They use planes that drop water and fire retardant and ground crews that dig fire breaks and set backfires. Pretty dangerous work, but somebody has to do it. The idea that humans would voluntarily run toward massive fires to fight them was beyond the aliens' comprehension. Oh, and it looks like Mount Rainier had some increased volcanic activity, Jake added. Just some minor gas emissions and small tremors. Scientists are keeping an eye on it. Volcanic activity? Professor Kelthon asked faintly. Yeah, it's a volcano. A mountain with molten rock underneath that sometimes erupts. Mount Rainier hasn't had a major eruption in a while, but it's still considered active. People live near mountains filled with molten rock? Zixtal asked. Well, Seattle is pretty close to Mount Rainier, and it's a great city. The mountain is actually really beautiful. Lots of people hike on it and ski there in winter. Jake's casual attitude toward volcanic recreation was the final straw for several students. Sage had turned completely white. Coralsha's gills had stopped moving, and Crystal Lynn looked like she might shatter from shock. This is just a normal week? Professor Kelthon asked weakly. Pretty much, Jake said, putting away his device. Actually, it's been pretty quiet lately. No major blizzards, no ice storms, no big floods. Summer's coming, so we'll probably start seeing more severe thunderstorms and heat waves soon. The bell chimed for the end of class, but nobody moved. They were all trying to process the fact that Jake had just described a week of weather that would require galaxy-wide emergency responses, and he considered it quiet. Tomorrow is Friday, Jake said cheerfully as he packed up. Maybe I can tell you about some of the outdoor activities people do for fun. Camping, hiking, rock climbing. I've got some great stories about survival training I did with my scout troop. As Jake left the classroom, Professor Kelthon sat down heavily and activated his emergency communication device. The Academy's Xenopsychology department needed to be informed immediately that they had completely underestimated what humans considered normal living conditions. Outside the classroom, the gathered professors exchanged worried glances. If this was what the human considered a quiet week, what would he consider exciting? Friday morning came with an unusual sight outside classroom 7 Alpha. Nearly half the Academy's teaching staff had found reasons to be in the hallway, all hoping to witness what had become known as the human revelations. Inside the classroom, the regular students sat with expressions of nervous anticipation mixed with dread. Jake walked in carrying his backpack and wearing a simple green shirt with some kind of image on it. Crystal Lynn noticed it showed mountains and trees with text that said, Camp Wilderness, Summer 2024. She wondered if this meant something ominous. Professor Kelthon stood at the front of the room, his crystal body dimmed with anxiety. He had spent the entire night reading reports from the Academy's Emergency Xenobiology Committee. Everything Jake had shared so far suggested that humans came from what could only be described as a planet-sized torture chamber. Good morning, class, Professor Kelthon said, his voice creating nervous harmonics. Today we will have our weekly personal sharing session. This is where we discuss challenges we have overcome and lessons we have learned. The students shifted, uncomfortably. Usually this was a time for sharing minor academic struggles or small social difficulties. After this week, nobody knew what to expect. Sage raised her hand tentatively. I'll go first. Last month I experienced my first major growth spurt. My leaf patterns changed overnight, and I felt awkward and different from my friends. But I learned that change is natural and that my new patterns are actually quite beautiful. The class nodded supportively. This was the kind of gentle personal growth they were used to hearing about. Crystal Lynn spoke next. I had a difficult experience when our family's meditation crystal developed a small crack. The imperfection made our home's harmony frequencies slightly off tune for 3 days. I learned to find inner peace even when external conditions aren't perfect. Again, the students murmured with understanding. These were the normal challenges of young people across the galaxy. Zixtal shared his story. I was temporarily disconnected from the hive mind during a communication system upgrade. For 6 hours I had to think completely independently with no guidance from my collective. It was terrifying, but I learned that I could survive brief periods of individual thought. The alien students all appreciated these stories of overcoming minor hardships and finding personal strength. Professor Kelthon looked at Jake with deep concern. Jake, would you like to share a personal challenge you've overcome? Jake shifted in his seat and looked thoughtful. Well, I don't know if my experiences are really the same as everyone else's. My life has been pretty different, I guess. Please, Professor Kelthon said carefully. Share whatever feels appropriate. Jake took a deep breath. Okay, I'll tell you about a trip I took with my dad when I was 12. It was one of those experiences that really taught me a lot about myself. The classroom fell completely silent. After everything they had heard this week, they knew that Jake's idea of a learning experience might be their idea of a nightmare. My dad wanted to teach me about self-reliance and survival skills, so he took me on what he called a wilderness adventure. We drove up into the Rocky Mountains, about 50 miles from the nearest town. Crystal Lynn was already glowing dimly, with fear. 50 miles from civilization sounded like exile to a desolate wasteland. We hiked about 15 miles into the backcountry carrying everything we needed in backpacks. Food, water, camping gear, first aid supplies. The trail went up to about 9,000 feet elevation. Finneray made a quiet choking sound. The elevation, Jake mentioned casually, would cause fatal oxygen deprivation for most galactic species. The first night was great. We set up our tent near a stream and cooked dinner over a campfire. Dad taught me how to purify water from the stream using tablets and a portable filter. Sage looked horrified. You drank water from an uncontrolled natural source? Sure, that's pretty normal when camping. You just have to treat it first to kill bacteria and parasites. The casual mention of deadly microorganisms in their drinking water made several students feel nauseous. The second day, we were hiking up to a ridge to see the sunrise when we ran into a mountain lion. Every student in the room stopped breathing. It was a big one, probably about 6 feet long plus the tail. Beautiful animal, but definitely dangerous. Dad had taught me what to do if we ever met a large predator. Professor Kelthon gripped his desk so hard his crystal fingers left marks. What did you do? We made ourselves look bigger by raising our arms and jackets over our heads. Made eye contact but didn't stare aggressively. Backed away slowly without turning our backs on it. The important thing was not to run because that triggers their chase instinct. Zixtal's compound eyes were completely dilated with terror. This creature could have killed you? Oh yeah, mountain lions are apex predators. They can leap 40 feet and take down animals much larger than humans. But they usually avoid people if you follow the right protocols. The students were learning that human children were taught military-grade survival tactics as normal life skills. The mountain lion watched us for maybe 10 minutes, then just walked away. Dad said we handled it perfectly. It was actually pretty exciting, Crystal Lynn whispered. You found a deadly encounter exciting? Well, it's not every day you see a wild mountain lion up close. They're amazing creatures. Jake continued his story. That afternoon, the weather started getting bad. Temperature dropped about 30 degrees in an hour, and it started snowing hard. 30 degrees? Sage asked weakly. Yeah, mountain weather can change really fast. Within 2 hours, we had about 8 inches of snow, and the temperature was down to about 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature drop Jake described would have killed most of his classmates instantly. Dad and I had to find shelter fast. We used our emergency gear to build a snow cave and waited out the storm. Spent about 18 hours in that cave until the weather cleared. Coralsha's gills were fluttering rapidly. You spent 18 hours? Buried in frozen precipitation? It's actually pretty warm inside a snow cave once you get it built right. Your body heat gets trapped and the snow insulates you. Dad taught me how to ventilate it properly so we wouldn't suffocate. The idea that humans could survive by burying themselves in frozen water while avoiding suffocation was beyond the aliens' comprehension. But then things got really challenging, Jake said, his tone becoming more serious. The students exchanged horrified glances. What could be more challenging than surviving predator encounters and being buried alive in ice? On the third day, while we were hiking back to our car, I slipped on some wet rocks and fell about 15 feet down a ravine. Broke my left arm pretty badly. Professor Kelthon made a sound like breaking crystal. You were injured in this wilderness? Yeah, a compound fracture, could see the bones sticking out and everything. Dad had taught me first aid, so I knew what to do. Used my belt as a tourniquet to stop the bleeding and splinted the arm with some straight branches and my extra shirt. The students sat in absolute horror as Jake casually described field surgery that would challenge trained medical professionals. But Dad had hit his head when he climbed down to help me. He had a concussion and kept drifting in and out of consciousness. So I had to get us both out of there. By yourself? Crystal Lynn asked in a voice barely above a whisper. Well, Dad was hurt, so yeah. I helped him walk, but I had to do most of the navigation and decision-making. Took us about 6 hours to hike back to the car with me using one arm and helping him stay focused. Jake paused thoughtfully. Then I had to drive us to the hospital. I was only 12 and didn't have a license, but Dad couldn't drive with a head injury. You operated a vehicle while injured? Zixtal asked in disbelief. It was about a 40-minute drive on mountain roads. Dad stayed awake enough to give directions, but I had to do all the driving. We made it to the emergency room okay. Jake smiled at the memory. The doctor said I did a good job with the first aid. My arm healed up fine, just have a small scar now. And Dad recovered completely from his concussion. The classroom was so quiet that the only sound was the soft humming of the air recycling system. That trip really taught me about taking care of family and staying calm in emergencies. Dad says it's one of his favorite memories of us together. Jake noticed his classmates' expressions and looked concerned. Is everything okay? You all look kind of pale. Professor Kelthon tried to speak but only managed a faint crystal chime. Oh, Jake said, brightening up. If you want to hear something really interesting, I could tell you about the time I went whitewater rafting, or when I helped fight forest fires as a volunteer. Those were pretty exciting adventures. Crystal Lynn finally found her voice. Jake, what you just described, surviving predator attacks, environmental disasters, serious injuries, emergency medical procedures, operating vehicles without training. On most worlds, any one of those would be considered a heroic military achievement. Jake looked confused. Really? It was just a camping trip. Pretty normal father-son bonding stuff. The classroom door opened and Academy Director Morthak entered, his ancient Zentari features flickering with urgent concern. Professor Kelthon, we need to speak immediately about reclassifying this student species threat level. Jake looked around at everyone's shocked faces and finally seemed to realize something was wrong. Did I say